All right. Um, okay. I think we are all set up.
Awesome.
Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Walker Bragman, and I am here with Lindsey Boylan. And you are running against Jerry Nadler.
Happily so.
Happily so. So I figured we could just launch right into it. Can you tell me why you decided to jump into this race?
Sure. So this is the most unequal district in the country. People know the west side of Manhattan, lower Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn as some of the most important places in our city and our country. We've got Stonewall, we've got Central Park, we've got the Upper West Side, we've got Wall Street, we've got the Statue of Liberty. We've got all these important places, and we also have the center of what is, in my view, one of two existential crises for our country, which is we have a new Gilded Age. A huge number of people are barely able to make ends meet. And we have a very small subset of people who are doing increasingly well and taking advantage of the combination of technology and the financial markets to keep doing better. And I think our government has been largely either silent or complicit in that. And it's not Republicans alone, it's Democrats and Republicans. And in this district where something like 15% of people are on SNAP benefits, where thousands of people are living in substandard housing, where at least a third of our community is severely rent burdened, meaning if they had one bad month before this pandemic, they could be out of their apartments, out of their homes. Think about what that means with this compounded moment in time. We are a super blue district, and yet we have someone who has not been talking about this issue, has not been acting on this issue for the almost 3 decades that he's been in office. And what can we look to show proof points that he's been listening and acting for his community? He's passed 3 pieces of legislation in 30 years. One of those is naming a building after the guy who died in office so he could get the seat. One of the other ones is ceremonial. And the third, which makes a lot of sense, is related to 9/11 funding, because Lower Manhattan is obviously in our district. This is also a person who takes hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporations every year. So we know what kind of leadership we're getting. We're getting someone who is going to tacitly approve of what the party leadership says and isn't going to change anything because he hasn't changed anything. And when I mentioned earlier what the 2 big existential crises of our generation are, it's extreme inequality and it's climate change and our failure to act on that. And the other thing about the district is it looks like a reverse J, and it's basically all coastline. So we're front and center for every climate-related disaster that's going to be coming our way. I worked throughout my career in public service. Most recently, I worked for the governor, who we can talk about things as well, as Deputy Secretary for Economic Development. So I was the jobs person. I also oversaw the state's recovery work in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria.
I was going to bring that up.
Sure, yeah. And so, I've had a big career actually getting things done and responding to problems because, one, that's how my mind works, and that's the whole reason why I'm in government. And I think there's no more important time for people in our community to see that government actually matters and it works, because they're seeing what happens when it doesn't work right now.
I mean, do you think that we're in a moment of sort of flux? Like it seems that we're having a lot of conversations. We're having should we be reopening the country and sending people back to work conversation. We're having the timeline conversation about when we can do that.
Yep.
But it doesn't seem like we're having the conversation of why people are resorting to protests.
Yeah.
And demanding that they be allowed to go back to work.
Well, I appreciated your tweet about it this morning. I think you said something: we either need to actually provide people with enough to live on in shelter in place, or respond to the increasingly antagonistic, anger that people are feeling. And it is, of course, a subset of people, but we haven't done enough to tide people over during this time. I'm talking to people every day. I assume that's where you're going with it, but I'm talking to people every day who still haven't gotten through to unemployment. It's not just that we have a stimulus package that didn't do what it was supposed to, but then we have the trickle down of state systems that don't accommodate what needs to happen, meaning this whole 72-hour response time isn't working. I know people who've called hundreds of times for unemployment and still haven't gotten it. I know someone who just got their $1,200 check. I know Puerto Ricans, as I understand it, haven't gotten a check at all. So a lot of it is not only a failure of policy, it's a failure of implementation.
I'm glad to hear you say that. So how do you cut through then? Because on the one hand, you do have people who are taking up, arms and showing up to state houses, and but they're not exactly open to Democrats.
No,
How do you cut through the tribalism that exists, I think, on both sides today?
Yeah. I think that's true. I think there are a lot of current debates that highlight the tribalism, that highlight how much our politics has descended. Even in our unwillingness to listen to journalists tell a story that some people don't want to hear, it's amazing how similar some Democrats become to Republicans that they've been fighting against for the last several years.
I assume that you're referring
Chris
to
Hayes. Chris Hayes talking about the Tara Reade story. But I don't want to go into that tangent, but that tribalism is real, and we see it on Twitter and how a lot of people end up building off of these online kind of rage fests that are really unfortunate. And then we have journalists at the center of them in a time where we have record number of journalists losing their jobs. I mean, I don't need to talk to you about what's happening to the industry now. But your question, what do we do? I'm not condoning what's happening in Michigan, for instance. I'm not okay with, and I do think that if it were a bunch of Black people wearing full fatigues and armor, that they would not be treated with kid gloves as they have been largely up until now. So I don't want to suggest that I'm condoning this in any way, but I do want to respond, to the real frustration that people have about not knowing what's going to happen, having a discoordinated federal and local and state response, which is adding to that. A lack of testing, which would enable us to move forward more clearly. And then people not even knowing if they're going to get another check or what's going to happen with their rent. I mean, I know entire buildings, I'm talking to people who just on straw polls, they've talked to their neighbors and a majority haven't paid rent. And that is a huge, that should be a light bulb, that should be a flashing light for every leader, that we have to find ways to deal with this. I think on the outset, and obviously no challenge is straightforward and easy and painless, or else it all would have been done. But I think one of the things that people miss in this conversation of means testing, I had proposed before the stimulus came out that everyone get a $2,000 check as a starting point. It's not just that it's the right thing to do, but it's also a more expedient way to proceed, because instead they have this bizarre, warped process of steps to try and figure out what
paperwork
people are going to get the checks, right? And
it's complicated.
That takes time. There are a lot of errors. There was that woman who received $8 million. Gosh, that would be fun for an hour. But think about how much time and bureaucracy it takes to direct things so that we help a very minuscule number of people who need to be helped. For instance, in New York, as you know, if you make more than $75,000, you're not doing okay right now. Think about rent. Think about the rent costs for the vast majority of people in this city. A lot more people needed help than got it just with the flat checks. So one thing, the way that we try and I don't want to take part in this, but the way our federal government tries to siphon off who gets what takes a tremendous amount of time, bureaucracy, and it adds to confusion, not just on people who are wondering if they're going to get it, but a government that has to convert itself to this manipulated process. And just as an aside, we're going to see the same thing, in my view, with absentee vote ballot applications in New York State. We should be streamlining and simplifying as much as possible on the outset if we want to lessen confusion. And this is something people should get. If you turn on one of the Market Watch shows, it's all about confidence and market response. Why don't we treat our own people and our own processes with the same intuitiveness of what people need to understand about their own government? So that's just one thing. When we try and tailor a solution in a way that our government isn't set up to do, it's set up to fail.
Why
So
do you
that's
think?
one thing.
Why do you think that is, that we are stuck in this mindset, which I guess I look at it sort of as like a time warp to the 90s.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
why have we changed so little?
I think I remember vividly when I'm originally from San Diego, but I moved to Northern Virginia when I was basically in middle school, and that was a hard culture shock. And I promise this story is going somewhere. And I fell in love with Washington, D.C. It was hard to fit in, at the time in Northern Virginia. It's changed a lot, but I found my place going and listening to congressional hearings. I was so interested. I bugged, every third, sixth degree of separation person I could to get a congressional internship. And oddly enough, no one's covered it yet, but I interned for Congressman Duncan Hunter, who's from parts of San Diego and Imperial County in San Diego, where I was originally from. And as you may know, it's the father of the current Duncan Hunter, and he's a Republican. And I have to say, the way that lobbyists, the way that special interest groups control access, in essence, to congressional offices of Republicans and Democrats alike, means that they really own our government. And I can't stress the importance of getting money out of politics, direct corporate money out of politics. And that is something that I have been very heartened to see the next generation of challengers. I mean, there are a lot of good things that I think are happening, but if we have companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year to ensure that our government does their bidding, that's the kind of government we get. And it's not just in direct donations to members of Congress like the one I'm running against, who takes max checks from all the tech companies that he purports to regulate through potential antitrust hearings. It's in who gets to write the legislation and the finer points of legislation that omit responsibility for corporations, omit actually doing things for people. And I understand some of this is the nature of the bureaucracy. There are fewer people who are working either in offices for members of Congress or assigned to committees. There just isn't enough seemingly staff to do the work, but that doesn't mean that our government should be relying upon special interests to do that. And I can't say enough how seamless the two seem to coexist. I mean, I remember all kinds of companies hosting little luncheons, and just staff would go get their lunch from whatever special interest group was holding a luncheon. I mean, just little things that you wouldn't even see. And then we're supposed to be happy enough with our member of Congress sending us a flag that's been flown over the Capitol, or we're supposed to be happy enough because they got us tickets to the Rotunda. And I hear that. I mean, when I press some people on, what is it that the Congressman Nadler has done for you? And they say that kind of stuff for the most part. And it's not good enough, but that is why our politics haven't changed. And I frankly think that's why there was so much fear from a lot of people about the potential for Bernie to become the party's nominee, because it's clear that he, and to a lesser extent before that as well, Elizabeth Warren, it's very clear that progressives, at the heart of what we're trying to do, it has so much to do, inherently to do, with taking the money as much as possible out of politics and dealing with it head on. And I think that's a huge part of the problem. And it's not just in direct contributions, as I said, it's in how DC works.
So your opponent is in the Medicare for All caucus.
Yep.
And has seemingly aligned himself with a bunch of progressive causes.
Yep.
You do not have faith that he will fight for those causes.
No, I mean, he's been in a lot of these progressive groups for the almost 30 years he's been in Congress. And that's my big issue with him. I'll give you an anecdote from the climate change arena, for example. I have many good friends who are either in city council, who work in city politics, because I've been in New York a long time, my whole adult life, who will say privately, I went to a speech that the congressman gave, and for the first time he mentioned climate change. I'm so glad you're running, because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, he never mentioned this. Now, did he sign on to every piece of, environmentally friendly legislation? Is he a proponent of the Green New Deal? Yes. But you and I both know that there are ways to support things tacitly, which is what most of Congress does, and there are ways to get things done. And he fails again and again in the getting things done category, particularly as someone who has been elevated to senior positions, first as I think the subcommittee chair for transportation, and now chair of the judiciary. But then again, that goes back to the other point. The Democratic Party is not set up to help people. It is set up to continue on the pattern of doing things the way that they've been done. And you do not get a committee chair because you are helping craft legislation that will change the lives of people in your community. You get a community chair because you do what you're told and you get in line. And we clearly saw that in the congressman's inability or unwillingness to hold President Trump account, and how he pursued tacitly, ultimately, the impeachment process. He's clearly not leading. He's taking direction from the speaker.
Well, it's interesting because a friend of mine, Peter Dow, credits your candidacy with pushing him on impeachment.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure you saw that.
Great. Yes.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, do you think that these problems are, they're obviously not isolated in candidates or in individual Congress people.
Yeah.
But and obviously there has to be accountability, right, for members of Congress. But how do you change the structure of an organization that has existed this way for decades?
Yeah.
I look at Pelosi as somebody who has done as little as possible to address the COVID crisis, for example.
Yes.
And somebody who on impeachment before that did as little as possible and had to be pressured and had to be pressured and had to be pressured. There doesn't seem to be the motivation, at least on her part, to take a step out of what is acceptable or the comfort zone, I guess. Yes. But I don't think that she's the root of the problem. I think that at a certain point, there is a structure that has existed in the Democratic Party, and maybe one that you're more familiar with than I am, having seen it up close. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I haven't made a career of studying the Republican Party, but there are some things that they seem to have grasped pretty well. And a good friend of mine who started Run for Something talks a lot about it. And it's that the Republican Party has really done a very good job of trying to engage the next generation of leaders, and even how their party gives out committee chairmanships, allocates leadership opportunities is frankly much more democratic than what the Democratic Party does. Basically, and I think we saw this with Pelosi's appointment of Donna Shalala for the review of the stimulus plan, someone who has a tremendous number of interlinking conflict of interest over someone like Katie Porter, who's a freshman congresswoman. Our party operates off of seniority. And that predates Nancy. So she originally, and I'm going to, paraphrase this shortly. She's a really interesting figure because she got her start, as I understand it, fundraising for the party in California. And then I think she tried a few different ways to actually get into elected office. I think the first time she failed, and then ultimately succeeded. She's a very smart woman. But our party is driven by who funds it, and it's driven by who stays in play the longest. And that flows through every decision-making process. And frankly, it also leads to a real lack of excitement from the American people. I mean, I think the American people will be a lot more excited and willing to listen if Katie Porter was leading the review of of this whole stimulus process. I mean, her whiteboard of why testing should be free was one of the most powerful things I've seen. And so I don't think it's Nancy's fault. One thing that I find fascinating that she said, however, when she met with Ro Khanna, I think the first time he challenged the system in much the same way that I am. He ran against an incumbent Democrat within his own party. They had a conversation. She said, I stick with my party always. That's the most important thing. And as he was leaving, this has been covered in some news piece. She said to him, just like a drop in the bucket, well, power is never given, it's always taken. And my observation of working for Andrew Cuomo is very similar. I think that—
Don't say.
Yes, I think that unfortunately there are no nice pleasantries when you're trying to change who has a seat at the table, when you're trying to change who has a voice in government. And, that does not begin and end with the speaker, this particular speaker or any speaker. It's the whole system. And it has to do with how our districts are drawn. It has to do with gerrymandering, which is not purely a problem of the Republican Party. If you look at my district, it's like it could be a caterpillar climbing across the city of New York, and most of them look like that. And that is all created. That whole system with almost 1 million people is created in that way to keep Congressman Nadler in his seat. That is why our district looks that way, because it wraps around and finds people for whatever reason in time that the state party assumed would be helpful to keep him in office. And that is how it works at a local level. So this whole system, I think, we see that with the DCCC's blacklist of challenger candidates and their staff, in essence. This system is not set up to help people. It's set up to keep people in office. And what's the best way to keep people in office? Make it hard for others to join, and to make sure that you get as much money from wherever you can to just restart that cycle of keeping the same people there.
So how do you excite people enough? I mean, you're running an insurgency campaign. Yeah. Largely grassroots funded. I know you've donated some of your own money to the campaign. Yep. But how, and especially now with COVID preventing, I guess, door knocking and stuff, how do you break through? How do you take the power?
Yeah, I have to say, and this is in no way meant that I would wish this moment on our country, on our city. I mean, we're the center of the epidemic. We've lost almost half the number of lives, accounting for the 50,000 plus lives lost. I think we will or already have passed the 20,000 number fairly soon here in New York. So I'm in no way saying that anything about this moment is okay. But I think this moment drives home for a lot of people the importance of effective government, even if they're learning the lesson because we don't have one, right? So I actually think I am able to call someone and have them want to talk to me now in a way that if I were knocking on their door 6 months ago, they'd be like, oh, piss off, lady. Is this like are you selling me something? Like when I would go try and talk to people at the subways or talk to people at a community event, everyone has a million things going on. They're trying to go about their lives, and I don't blame them, right? Like, people shouldn't have to live in politics. But unfortunately, in this moment, people have to live in politics because it means they either get their check to cover their rent or buy their groceries, or they don't. It means that we're going to have testing in the city so that we can have some confidence to reopen our economy, or we don't. So I mean, I haven't heard people say this, and maybe it's because it's hard to say, or maybe because they're not talking to actual voters like the congressman, and people in the community. But I'm finding that people are wanting to tell their story, and they're wanting people to represent them that understand their story and are going to make every decision based off of the pain points that people have. So my challenge is, how do I reach as many of our people as possible? And what does it mean in an environment where people have gone elsewhere? And what does it mean in an environment where there's a lot of confusion, which is an intentional thing made by the governor, to create confusion and cause challenges for candidates like myself. But luckily for enough, I worked for the man, so I know how the games go.
The ballot decision, that recent ballot decision,
Yeah.
seems rather suspect. That
it is.
That you're
It
going to
is very
continue
suspect.
holding down ballot primaries. You're just going to remove the presidential line.
Yeah.
What purpose does that serve if not to weaken grassroots candidates and the left?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many ways I can answer that question. I'll give 3 different answers. One is it's total bullshit. Obviously, as an answer about safety for voting during this crisis, because when would you ever want the state party leader and the state board of elections to say, we do not want people to participate in the electoral process. We do not want New Yorkers to voice their preference for president. We do not want that. We do not want as many people to show up. And hey, we don't want as many people to show up for the congressional races, because that's what they're saying. So it's total bullshit. And a secondary sort of operational reason why it's total bullshit is they already made a very significant change, as you probably know, to have no-fault absentee voting. So people are going, in essence, to be suggested to vote largely absentee. That's the direct outcome of that. So we are already looking at a system that is going to accommodate ways for people to vote that doesn't require them showing up for the most part. So why you would add on top of that ending the presidential piece of this, if you really have that many concerns about safety with voting in person, find a way to implement exclusively absentee voting that still allows people who are housing insecure and the like to vote. If that's really what you care about, design a system that does that. But that's not what they care about. They care about depressing turnout and trying to keep in any way they can electeds as safe as possible. And then thirdly, from a strategic standpoint, if you really cared about bringing the party together and supposedly trying to enfranchise progressives and align them to really beat back Donald Trump, if we really cared about that, you would not find the most obvious way to show them that they don't matter to you at all. And that's what the governor just did. He basically said, you know what, your ability to voice your expression for president doesn't matter, and I hope you stay home. That's basically what he said. And that does not get anywhere close to providing or clearing a path for party unity. And if people really care about getting Donald Trump out of office, they should care about that.
Well, it does seem like they're playing a little bit with fire. Although, granted, I don't think that the left is going to be I don't think those are going to be the voters that really determine the election. I think it'll be the same voters that determined the last election, the working class voters in states like Michigan or
yes.
Wisconsin. That seems to be the conventional wisdom. However, it doesn't make sense why you would risk the votes of young people, the votes of progressive people. It does seem, and it also seems to set a dangerous precedent. Like I can just cancel this here primary election.
Yes, it sets a dangerous precedent, and every kind of precedent that we, Rubicon that we go through that way, gives us less credibility up against someone who doesn't value anything about democracy any day. It doesn't help us against Donald Trump when we do these kinds of things. It doesn't help us against the GOP when we say that they're the people they're the party that disenfranchises people, and they're the party that does voter suppression. It doesn't help.
So I'd like to pivot a little bit
Sure.
and go back to the coronavirus. How are you holding up? I know that, I mean, you're in Manhattan.
Yeah.
How, and there are I have a friend who sent me some photos of freezer truck or refrigerated truck morgues. I mean, how are you holding up just day to day?
Yeah. It's, and I'm also a mom. I have a 6-year-old. So she's in kindergarten right now. And I had to go out and be like, do not come in for the next hour because I'm in an interview. And she has that, if you watch that video of the journalist and his kids like come in the background, I have this fear of that happening. The biggest challenge for me, I have my own level of privilege because I've gotten to a place where my husband and I, we're okay. So the thing that is hardest for me is staying here, because you always like, if this is my career and kind of my mind works around how can I fix a problem, how can I understand it and do something about it, it's really tough to be in my apartment and not helping, right? I wish I were a doctor. I wish I had some medical skill. I wish I could do something more. So obviously I've been doing a lot of video content. I've been trying to push as much as I can on the things I think that should happen and should change. And I think my team is like, go do that, because I'm bugging them a lot. But I mean, I'm fine. I have a tremendous amount of frustration about how many people are not, because I'm talking to people every day who have so many challenges, like immunocompromised people who don't have any way to get groceries, right? Effectively without potentially hurting themselves because their SNAP benefits, they can't, get delivery. And you had asked the question earlier that I just want to comment on really quickly. Making changes is about what you prioritize. And the fact that we have a pilot case in New York State with the Department of Agriculture to do online like SNAP cards so that people could get delivery to their apartments. And that's been in play, I think, for at least a year. That's been something we've been trying. But having worked for one of the most intense politicians in the country, I know when you prioritize something, you can get it done. And to me, making it easier and streamlining the process for people to access and get their food who are our most vulnerable people should probably be a priority. Kind of like NYCHA probably should have been a priority, I don't know, a decade and a half ago, when, we have a federal government who walked away from responsibility to the tune of $40 billion for NYCHA, same things. And so I think being in any of these positions, being in Congress is an issue of prioritizing. And it's clear to me that our most vulnerable and the future dealing with inequality and climate change have not been priorities. That wasn't the question you asked, but I find a way to say.
No, and look, I appreciate it. It's refreshing because you don't hear a lot, at least on CNN or MSNBC or Fox. You don't hear a lot of politicians talking about how government can work. Yeah. It can work. It isn't right now, and I don't see much will to change it. I see one party saying, "Well, that's just the way it is." Yeah. And, we're doing the best that we can, but that's just the way it is. And the other party saying, like we have to, government is the problem. We don't want more government. We don't want more government. Actually, Pelosi said we want as little government as possible. So I guess it is sort of both.
And I have to say, the Republicans, not all, but some have been very strategic about starving programs so they appear as if they don't work. Starving any kind of assistance programs so that they can then say, see, it doesn't even work. You're out there on your own. Let's just make it easier for you to be out there on their own. Let's just make sure we don't take tax money from you. Let's just make sure the bad government isn't doing something that is going to hurt you. And they're responsible for things not working. And we have not had. And that, I think, is also why people like AOC and Ayanna Pressley are particularly inspiring, because some of this is about winning the rhetorical argument. Some of this is about getting out there and explaining to people what they're losing and who's responsible. Like, we actually have to have people who can get up there and make you listen to them. And I think people like AOC are incredibly effective at that. I mean, I don't think we should discount the role of that. I mean, just look at how poorly Congressman Nadler did in making the case for the Senate on impeaching Donald Trump. He had to resort purely to trading barbs with the Republicans versus Adam Schiff, who I think, even if he wasn't going to have people agree with him, he spoke poetically, he spoke compellingly. I do think that we need the importance of people who can either speak from the heart, speak extemporaneously, talk about issues, and understand a problem. Katie Porter again. I know I'm naming all women, but there are a lot of really good men. I named Adam Schiff.
Named Adam Schiff.
Yeah.
No, and look, I have to say that the most inspiring people today in Congress may indeed be women. I mean, the squad is what the future of the Democratic Party, I think, should look like.
Yes.
Arguably, what the future of the Democratic Party does look like.
Yes.
But in order to get there, you do have to break through.
Yes.
And that remains an open question of how to do that.
Yeah.
I know that you're running a strong campaign. There are a number of I've interviewed a number of people who I think are running good campaigns or have good messages or just true believers. And I think that it's important to get those people into office. But then once you're in office, to move those, as you said, to move those people up, is sort of, I guess, a key to a healthy party that has a future. But that doesn't, as you said, that doesn't seem to be happening right now.
No, it's not. It's not. And that's why I think it is pretty powerful that people like Ayanna Pressley and AOC have said that they, have been pretty vocal about the DCCC, have been vocal about some of the things that don't work in the party, because if we don't increase transparency, it's hard for people to understand how much is broken. And then you have organizations, Amanda Lippman, who started Run for Something, who's basically trying to find a way to support local candidates at the state and local level, because the Democratic Party doesn't provide enough support. I think there are a lot of really good things happening. I mean, maybe there's like my wiring. I'm an optimist, even though I've grown up in a realist environment. And I really believe this is already changing. I mean, the people who support Medicare for all, it's the country. I mean, maybe we have people who, will dance around and say, people want to keep their insurance, even though like I can't even regularly name who my insurer is. I just know who my doctor is, right? I think Pramila.
Have you talked to anybody in the campaign trail? Sorry to interrupt. Have you talked to anybody on the campaign trail who has said, I really like my private insurance, and hands off, keep your government hands off my private insurance?
It's so, that's another great example that has two challenges with it. One is through court cases and through stripping away. And then you had Nancy Pelosi say, we'll find out what's in the bill when it gets passed with the Affordable Care Act, right? So that was a problem right there. And I think she probably regrets it, probably like her saying Joe Biden is Joe Biden, a number of flops, obviously. But one, the Republicans did what they do by stripping away its ability to be effective, taking out things like long-term care insurance, which is huge for families. Like a lot of women that I talk to in my community aren't only caring for their kids, they're caring for their parents. And that's going to be bigger now after this whole coronavirus, particularly with the number of deaths in nursing homes. And people are going to really question the value of nursing homes. And that's going to be a challenge in a different way. And then the Democrats did what they typically do, which is assume that it was good enough that so many people still couldn't afford what called the Affordable Care Act. I talked to a number of people in my community that would absolutely never willingly sign up for something that they can't afford. It's not affordable. And
exchanges.
And the reality is, when you call something in essence affordable and then it's not, you turn people further away from you and ever thinking that you're going to provide them solutions. And the minute people no longer think they can go to government to get any solutions, we become a very different country. And I'm all in on Medicare for all. I think it's very hard to see how you could be against that in this moment in time. I mean, how many lives could we have saved if we, taking the long view here, how many people with pre-existing conditions, the asthma, other things, could we have helped earlier on in life so they wouldn't have been pushed to the brink this way?
Been vulnerable today.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many ways. And I would add to that too, because it's really important to me, right up there with, issues of housing as an expression of inequality in the city, which we led with, and then climate change, is mental health, because it's not getting its proper dues. Not a single member of the New York City delegation in Congress is a member of the Mental Health Caucus. And first of all, I come from a family with a lot of mental illness, generations of it, that is probably systemic and related to things like poverty and loss of custody and things like that. So no blame. Just the reality is we have an epidemic in mental health that predates the public crisis that we're in. And this public health crisis that we're in is only going to exacerbate the mental health crisis in this country. You hear these terrible realities of what EMTs and nurses and doctors and essential workers of every kind are dealing with. The stress of trying to provide for your family, the stress of living in complete isolation. All of this is contributing to what was already the single biggest cause of disability, globally speaking, who World Health Organization says depression is the biggest cause of disability worldwide. So we're not talking about this issue, but and I do sometimes think we miss the opportunity when we talk about healthcare as a human right to say that mental health care is a human right as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense why we are, like, among industrialized nations, the only one that isn't providing these kinds of services. And
Yes.
I've talked to friends of mine who are doctors, who are nurses, and ask, like, how are things going? And it's always like, well, we're doing our best, but our patchwork insurance is complicated. We do the best we can for patients.
Yes.
But it does feel like we were sort of primed for a crisis like this,
Yes.
or left systemically vulnerable, and not just
Oh,
and
yes.
not just in healthcare, but in
Yes.
trade as well. We
Yes.
lack domestic supply chains for
Yes.
medical supplies, and that's
Yes.
something I haven't heard many people talking about.
No. Well, that's a great example. I mean, because if we had national run healthcare system, we would absolutely be able to better manage resource allocation, PPE. We absolutely would be able to, we would know much better our quote unquote stockpile for ventilators. We would know much better. We would be forced to think regionally about how to respond to a health crisis. And absolutely, things like agencies like the CDC could much more effectively advise on a healthcare system run centrally, oversight run centrally. And it's very obvious that we would have been in a very different place with testing. Even related policies like paid sick leave, which I was very involved with getting it done in New York, trying to engage the business community support when I was basically the jobs person for the state. But that we don't have paid sick leave at the federal level means that people have to go to work and when they're sick, and we're just perpetuating the community spread, right? Every system we have and our failure to do the basics for families mean that people are running the risk of spreading this virus more quickly. Another example, I mean, South Korea, when this happened, were giving care packages in essence to all families. So please don't go out. Here's your care package. If you don't have any other alternatives, you're going to go out and spread the virus because you have to get food or you have to go to work. You have to do your essential work. It's every aspect of this crisis would have been dealt with better if we had better policies in place that put people first.
It really does. It really does seem like the Democratic Party worked so hard. It worked so hard behind the scenes to sort of quell a left wing
Yeah.
revolution, and then almost immediately after they succeed,
Yeah.
this crisis blows up and proves a need for virtually, I think, virtually every major aspect
Yes.
of the revolution's platform, like a Medicare for all system, um,
Yes.
better trade policies so that we don't incentivize our manufacturing. Like, we've heard for years that manufacturing is like the jobs of yesterday, and
Yeah.
oh, ideas are the currency of the 21st century. And it does seem rather arrogant now,
Yeah.
as
Yes.
we struggle to uh, stockpile things like ventilators or
Yes.
personal protective uh, gear for doctors like that. It's, I mean, it's almost like all of this was very foreseeable, and yet the we've been led down this road for so long, and it does
Yes.
seem like we have another 4 years at least of being led down this road,
Yeah.
uh, either by a Trump presidency, Trump getting reelected, or by a Joe Biden presidency where it'll be presumably more of the same.
Yeah. I mean, and I have to say, I don't, there are a few journalists who've covered it very well, so I don't want to take credit for this idea, but it's absolutely also an introduction to the reality we face with climate change. This is a slow, like this is a molasses moving thing that we're going to confront. I mean, it's moving quickly, but we've seen it coming, and increasing climate related disasters, which can only expect, particularly in coastal cities, increasing extreme weather, period, increasing food scarcity, all of this stuff we have to expect, and we have not organized ourselves in a way to deal with it. And that same fractious state versus federal, our inability to pass legislation that actually puts people first instead of corporations, all of it is just, it's so heartbreaking, because to your point, if we could move forward with a progressive agenda, we would already be dealing with a lot of these issues in a much better way.
Yeah, we'd be way more prepared.
Yes.
Seemingly, we would be way more prepared.
Yeah.
Why is it that we can only deal with a crisis when it's immediate, when it's pressing, when it's happening? We never seem to have the foresight.
Yeah.
Uh, and why is that? And how do you change that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the challenge is hard to change, in that people are elected to serve fairly short terms, right? So everything is about their short-term returns, right? So even when I worked for the governor's administration, it was about, announcing things, right? And making sure that the press coverage is there so that you can get credit for it. Well, it's easier to announce something that's happening than announce, oh, we found a sustainable way to cover the pension plans for the future. That does not excite, unfortunately. So I have to say, part of this, there's one aspect of this that is inherently difficult, because you're asking people to make decisions for the benefit of, like, not just my 6-year-old now, but her 6-year-old and her 6-year-old. And that is hard to do. So I get that. But I think we can't waste this moment of showing how destructive lack of investment in important ideas and important policies is, because that's the same argument people make against things like Medicare for all. Oh, it's just so expensive. Do you want to know something expensive? How much we're going to end up paying for this crisis?
Yeah.
That is truly expensive. In the short term and the long term. And what will we have gotten for this? Somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people are gone. How many thousands of small businesses are permanently shuttered? how many people have been going hungry, how many kids have not received the necessary basic education in this time, who don't have access to laptops or high-speed internet, all of these things. We allow ourselves to be, how do I say this, conned by the effectiveness of the Republican Party's messaging, by having the inability to move past the stupid question of how are we going to pay for this? Because, man, are we paying for not doing it now?
Right. The answer to that question is we will.
Yes.
One way or another, we
Yes.
will pay for it. It's just,
yes.
you want to pay
yes.
on the front end, or do you want to pay on the back end when everything?
Yeah. Do you want to pay? Do you want to pay planning out a future, or do you want to pay responding to a crisis?
Right. I mean, I have to say, it's very refreshing talking to candidates like yourself,
It's fun for me.
Things, I think, and at least for me, and maybe I'm somewhat not a representative case, because I do live in politics.
Yeah.
This world has become more or less most of my life.
Yeah.
It's not my personal.
Same here, unfortunately.
Yeah. But it's very hard, at least for me, to be hopeful, and I can't imagine what it would be like for just a casual observer looking at this, and just like, how do you find hope and motivation to get through, to continue the work that needs to be done, even in the face of overwhelming odds? I mean, the chances are that 2020 is going to be a bad year for progressives.
Yeah.
Because their organizing has been cut into very deeply by this crisis.
Yes.
Present company perhaps excluded.
Yes, absolutely.
But what advice would you give to activists to keep them, who are maybe feeling a little less than hopeful at this moment?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with a really quick sort of anecdote, because people are always like, one of the original questions I got a lot was like, why would you want to do this? This sounds like, why want to you're either like some egomaniac who like wants to see their face everywhere. And it's odd, because I'm, generally speaking, an introvert. I'm not shy, but I'm an introvert. So I don't need to be seeing my name everywhere. But you think about these things, like, how do I explain this to people? And for me, I'm doing well in life now. I've had like so many opportunities that all of my family members before me didn't have. Like, I grew up with a lot of challenges in my family, as I mentioned, mental illness, and dealing with family members and suicide, and issues of joblessness, stuff like that. And for me, when I was a little girl, I would always try and like organize things and figure out how they work. And I think you could probably see that in how I answer questions even. I'm interested in how things work. And it was this desire from a very early age to figure out a problem. And maybe it was, I thought when I was younger, so I could fix things in my own family. But then I realized this is about fixing other people's family and preventing some of the things that I saw, or that I heard about, or that I hear about now from happening. And that to me is very personally motivating. So I will always have that. And one of the interesting things, and I think is a great thing about, my personal feeling of being a challenger and being a progressive in this moment in time, is I'm actually quite effective when I get angry. I'm probably most effective when I'm angry. And so every time, the congressman's people come and like mess with me, my anger level is very effectively channeled to action. And I'm not suggesting that everyone has these two aspects to their personality. Like, really, I enjoy channeling my anger. And I also enjoy trying to figure out problems operationally. So for me, when I focus on those two things, I'm endlessly interested in what I'm doing. And I think when we look outside to try and get that fire, like what is inspiring us, it becomes harder, because it's easy to kind of see the universe. But what really matters is what inspires someone to get engaged. And I think a lot of people have been inspired by not having healthcare insurance. I mean, Amy Villela, who you may know, ran in Nevada, was a fellow brand new Congress candidate. And she's also doing our quarterly reports. She was inspired by the loss of her daughter and wanted to change the world in America, at least, for the healthcare system, because she didn't want other people to suffer the same way. And I think we all, activists in particular, have our own entry point. And it's not that we shouldn't be, focused on what other people are doing, but staying true to that feeling is really important. And, it's also amazing to live in a time where, as a woman, I can say I'm angry, and it's like, oh, it's not a bad thing. And so we have a long way to go with women's place in this country, as I think we're seeing with our two potential options for president. But I do see progress. And like I said earlier, people more than ever right now need their government to work, and it's not working like it should. And that, to me, is a real call to action. So I find that very, I don't want to say inspiring, because that's a positive thing, but I find that very helpful to keep me, to keep my passion focused.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time
Thank you.
with me.
Thank you.
As I said, it's very refreshing to hear somebody be so candid, and somebody, I think you have a unique background, unique experience that that gives you a fairly interesting insight into the world of power. This time we didn't get to talk as much about Cuomo,
Sure.
but I hope that you'll come back and that
Yes. And in the meantime, read The Contender, because it's a great book.
Okay, I will do that. But Ms. Boylan, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe, you and your family.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I really do. And thank you very much.
Take care.